And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I appreciate you tuning in, whether you're a first-time listener or long-time listener. And hopefully you find these conversations helpful as you think about teaching and learning and preparing students for the modern world. As we thankfully seem to be at least mostly emerging from the COVID cloud that has impacted us all so greatly over the last year, we're looking for your feedback on what kinds of things you are most wondering about and most need from a professional development perspective. You'll probably notice some things that we will push out on social media and on our website, but as we look to the future, certainly some of the things that we have always offered, which are things like project-based learning and differentiated instruction, both on-site and online, and other areas of pedagogy and teaching and learning will be available. But we also want to know what kinds of things, perhaps specifically about those areas of pedagogy and perhaps other things that might have bubbled to the surface as a result of the changes to teaching and learning from COVID-19. So if you have questions and have certain thoughts about that, I'd love to hear. My email is drew@teachthought.com. And again, I'd love to hear any of those thoughts, comments, questions, concerns. We're seeing a typical uptick in people looking for professional development for the spring, summer, and fall and going forward. So please navigate to wegrowteachers.com, and there you'll find many areas in which we work and ways to request more information about our workshops and services. In this episode, I spoke with Greg Lukianoff, who is the president of F.I.R.E, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. The website is thefire.org, and we talked mostly about the blog piece that he published on thefire.org, and we will link to that in the show notes. But it's entitled The Empowering of the American Mind, parentheses beta version, 10 Principles for Opposing Thought Reform in K12, published on April 27th of this year, 2021. And we talked about and went through the 10 principles that he is proposing to help navigate the thought reform and freedom of speech and thought expression in our K12 settings. And it says beta version in parentheses because he is and they are asking for feedback on this as they develop it, and reached down into the K12 setting where he says he's getting more and more messages from folks who are concerned about the thought reform and freedom of speech in our K12 settings. So certainly an important issue for teachers and parents and students to consider, and I hope it's helpful. I'm very pleased to be with Greg Lukianoff, who is the president of F.I.R.E, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We're going to talk about freedom of speech and thought reform in K12, specifically, hopefully guided by the article that you've posted on fire.org, and we'll link this in the show notes. But the empowering of the American mind, in parentheses beta version, 10 principles for opposing thought reform in K12. But before we get into that, I guess give just a little bit of background. Some folks may not be as familiar with you as I am.
My own background?
Yeah.
Well, I'm a constitutional lawyer. I specialize in First Amendment law in law school. When I graduated in 2000, I went looking for a First Amendment job, which are kind of hard to find. And I was offered to be the first legal director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. That was about a year and a half old. So I've been defending free speech, academic freedom, due process on campus for a long time. But then I started developing a pretty intense interest in psychology. My overall theory for coddling was that not only are we teaching a generation the habits of censors, we're teaching a generation the habits of anxious and depressed people. And I brought this idea to my friend Jonathan Haidt. We wrote an article about it in 2015 called "Against My Wishes: Coddling the American Mind," and then a book, once again against my wishes, called "Coddling the American Mind," came out in 2018. And I've been updating it ever since on my blog, The Eternally Radical Idea. What's going on here is that I've been getting so many questions about what looks like, what we call F.I.R.E. thought reform going on in K-12. I wanted to give some, sort of old-fashioned, classic, liberal kind of ideas on how you, on what a K-12 classroom should look like, what principles for respecting conscience and individuality and all that kind of stuff.
And what was the title you had in mind for coddling?
The original article, I wanted it to be arguing towards misery, which is an incredibly boring name. However, it's more accurate to what my point was. That essentially I felt like we were talking ourselves into anxiety and depression, telling ourselves we're more fragile than we are can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we predicted, there would be, maybe some mild increase in anxiety and depression, measurable but not severe. But it's really tanked. Like that since starting in around 2013, you start seeing, mental health results for younger people are just terrible. I mean, honestly, like it scares the hell out of me. If I can talk like that. And one of the first things we did in the series Catching Up with Coddling, which I've been doing for about a year, was we looked at the mental health data, and it's only gotten worse for young people. Oh, and for the book, I wanted to call it Disempowered, which is why I was glad to be able to call this The Empowering of the American Mind.
So you get the final word.
Well,
or something
I'll always be associated with coddling. I guess I just have to note my protest and go with it.
Yeah. So again, I talked with Jonathan, I think in 2019, about the book, so folks can, certainly we'll link to the show notes and that kind of thing. Go back and listen to that, and I really recommend it. I mean, it's a great book. It's really instructive and useful, and I think especially increasingly so, not just in the freedom of speech, but in some of the pieces of anxiety and fragility and anti-fragility. And as the father of two daughters, 12 and 14, I mean, it scares the hell out of me as well. I mean, just that fragility there's some of that's natural, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much on this, but like yesterday, I was talking. We were coming home from school. My daughter asked. There was a stoppage of traffic, and she said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, there's something up here, a big truck or something. I don't know what it is." And then she asked a question that was. It felt like she maybe didn't listen to me, and because she did have AirPods in, and I said something like, "Did you not hear me?" And she reacted as though I was like really coming on too strong, and I was like, what kind of fragility is this, right? And now she's 14, and I think there's some par for the course there, but there's also a real battle that I think many parents are in with some of the incentive structures of social media and just the sort of overall tone of the culture wars, which a 14-year-old's not deeply into. At least my 14-year-old's not deeply into it, but yeah, I think that's a really important piece. And so the piece that you've got here, The Empowering of the American Mind, and you've got a beta version. We'll talk about why that's beta. You've got 10 principles, and some of them, the first several, sort of the first half maybe, or something roughly like that, is more around speech and thought, but then gets into some of the mental health pieces that you're mentioning. But let's, I guess, maybe start with like why. What's the point of this, and why the beta version?
Well, the point of it is that, I specialize in higher education, but increasingly we're realizing that we have to get to students earlier because they're coming in, I'd say hostile to freedom of speech. I think would not be too strong, partially because they've been taught that it's the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And they haven't actually been taught anything more serious about it, about how it's actually it exists to protect minority viewpoints. And I always have to point out, robber barons and rich people are protected by virtue of being rich and powerful. And bullies and bigots are protected to the extent to which they represent majority standpoints. You only need, in a democracy, you only need freedom of speech to protect minority points of view. But this idea has been completely flipped on its head in higher education by institutions, frankly, that can't admit that they are, overwhelmingly politically homogenous, and that they're powerful. And this leads to this absolutely bizarre kind of idea that free speech is the argument of the powerful and of the oppressor. And I feel like it falls to us in a lot of cases to come in and, to explain some of that, but also to try to erode this sort of moral certainty. Because if you believe you know everything coming into college, or at least you know everything regarding sort of complex issues of morality and propriety, what need do you have of college in the first place? And why is it beta version? It's because I'm new to this, because I know I'm not a K-12 expert. So I wanted to see what parents think about it. To be frank, I'm somewhat less interested in what educators think about it, because I'm mostly getting this question from parents. But I do feel like someone needs more or less to give permission for parents to say, hey, I believe in, small L liberal ideas about individuality, speech, conscience, independence, all of these things.
Yeah. So I wonder too, I think this is a reasonable question to be asking about lots of the things that happen in the culture war, and, Twitter being an example of such an awful discourse or lack of discourse, and yelling at each other. And, like critical race theory, for example, being a really hot topic. And I've been highly critical of critical race theory on several instances. But I also wonder, there's sort of I wonder how much of a moral panic there is, and an overstatement of the problems of this kind of fragility, and this kind of critical race theory, for example, is being taught in our schools and everywhere, all of this kind of thing. And so and even in the context of how pervasive you say you're getting a fair amount of I guess messages or some complaints, or I don't know how you characterize them, from parents and maybe from educators, but how common is that? I guess it's almost impossible to figure out, right?
Yeah, and the truth is I don't know. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to make these principles kind of as universal and timeless as possible, because even if it isn't a problem at some schools, I think it's okay. I think that we've lost thought of people as individuals. We kind of have blurred the idea of, right to your own beliefs. So I wanted to make it sort of as universal as possible. That being said, I'm getting approached by parents from all over the place at the moment, and they're saying it's really intense. And I don't claim to completely understand CRT, and I think that it's being used as a term to just describe heavy-handed ideology. In general, and I think it's probably inaccurate to describe all of that just as CRT. I mean, for goodness sakes, you can teach CRT as long as it's not treated like a belief that you have to show fealty to.
Right. Dogmatic.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm hearing enough of it that I spent months trying to think of what I thought the principles should be, but I wanted to make it beta to hear what parents actually had to say.
Yeah, the thing, again, and I don't want to dwell on CRT too much, but the thing I'm in the middle of, I'll hold it up here for people who are not able to see this.
Hey, I love that book.
Right, Kindly Inquisitors, which I've been trying to get to for a number of months or maybe even a year. I'm about halfway through Kindly Inquisitors, New Attacks on Free Thought. I think it's early 90s publication? 93, yeah. And, the thing what strikes me is the application or lack of application of what Jonathan Rauch, the author, labels as liberal science, right? Which is, to the extent of anything, including critical race theory or Trumpism or whatever, you could go down the list of sort of ideological, sort of dogmatic kinds of pieces. To the extent that they're not open to criticism and question, then there becomes a problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. The and one of the things I talk about in the piece that is a idea that I've introduced, and probably have to write a separate article about it. A concept that a lot of Americans probably don't know is that one of the things that America, in my opinion, is credited with is having a quote unquote thin identity. What that doesn't sound nice, but what it means is that people like me, who's both my parents are immigrants, from different parts of the world. One's Russian, one's Irish. That I grew up in a community that had people from Vietnam and Puerto Rico and Mexico and Korea, all living in the same place. But we all thought of ourselves as Americans, and that identity didn't require much. We believed in democracy. We certainly believe in freedom of speech. We took that for granted. But everything else, there was just not a lot of boxes you had to check to be an American, and that's really useful for a genuinely diverse society. Is to have an idea that that entry is not that difficult. But what I fear is going on, and by the way, I'm hearing this more from elite private schools than anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Is that there's an attempt to give people to give kids a very kind of thick idea of what reality actually looks like, of what a proper person should believe, what their behavior is, all this kind of stuff that goes well beyond the kind of more hazy general values like honesty, fairness, all these kind of stuff, which I have no objection to. But the more that you tell people that they need to believe specific things, and the more specific you get, the more problematic that becomes if you're trying to have a free, pluralistic, diverse society.
Yeah, and does it make sense or have you figured this out? I guess the question is the idea of the freedom of speech and quality of speech versus academic freedom, which is certainly very highly relevant in the university, higher education setting, but maybe not as relevant in K12. I'm wondering how you've sort of thought about that as you've dived into this.
That's a great question. Academic freedom, of course, is distinct from free speech. I think of it as an overlapping kind of like Boolean sphere. Academic freedom is protected by the First Amendment, for example, but what exactly academic freedom means in terms of the law is a little messed up. In terms of what it means in terms of philosophy, I think it's best laid out by the American Association of University Professors. But it's all about, inquiry. It's all about good pedagogical practice, also good methodology. All of these ideas, within academic freedom, it's about approaches to figuring out what the world actually looks like. That has a lot less application to K through 12 because K through 12 is considered to be preparatory. And whereas universities are how the whole world, looks to American universities to better understand the world, K through 12 is supposed to do more, direct teaching, for example. It's also distinct in the fact that, and this is where some of the current political situation comes in, is that unlike higher education, state legislatures, local boards, all these kind of stuff play a role in deciding what curriculum should be in K through 12, which is not something they're allowed to do in higher education for very understandable reasons. So currently, a lot of the fight is state legislatures passing bills against CRT, for example, some of which I've read, and I think they're kind of almost laughably unconstitutional as applied to higher education. But then some of them that I've read, like the much maligned one out of Idaho, a lot of what it's saying is that people shouldn't be singled out because of their race. Children shouldn't be led to feel guilty about things that they didn't do. A lot of it, there in some cases, I'd prefer that people actually read the text of the law rather than take people's interpretations of it. Some of it is like I said, unconstitutional. But it's novel in a First Amendment lawyer's experience to see something where the state legislature isn't trying to impose indoctrination. They're trying to, at least nominally, they're trying to avoid it.
Yeah, and I've read some of that text or those legislative efforts, and I wonder how much, as I read them, certainly some of them, for example, and this is not the legislative pieces, but like when Trump was still in office, the 1776, commission or whatever, which felt like it was not particularly in the spirit of liberal science. And I wonder the idea of, or how much or many of these legislative efforts that you mentioned that you do use some of the language of, we shouldn't discriminate on race or any immutable characteristics, are maybe co-opting some of that language in an effort to sort of use it as a weapon against, what they perceive as a threat from 1619 or CRT or diversity, equity, inclusion, that kind of thing.
Yeah. When it comes to 1619, the attempt to there are some bills that actually flat out say, like, you can't teach 1619 curriculum. Whether or not that's constitutional, I've been, like I said, I'm trying to figure it out. I think they probably can do that. That's probably within their power to decide, like, this is a whatever you call it, sort of a curriculum that we don't want in the schools. Then there's a question of should they do that, and that's entirely different. I confess, when I look at some of the criticism of 1619, and being a constitutional lawyer myself, I do think it's a lot wrong, to be honest. And it's actually been backtracking bit by bit due to critics. So I think it's a situation where I think some of the criticism is actually warranted. I do think that there is an attempt to use sort of neutral language to try to address what they see as kind of what might have once been called reverse racism, but really is just, as far as I'm concerned, just old-fashioned racism. And to the extent to which they limit the bills that limit themselves to that, I think they're probably on pretty good legal footing, for one. And it turns into a situation, if classes aren't doing this, then some of this legislation isn't going to be as much of a problem. Now, this makes an important distinction: facial unconstitutionality versus as applied. So I think that some of the laws that are coming out, again, facially unconstitutional as applied to higher ed, easy. Constitutionality as applied to K through 12, a little more questionable. However, if students start getting in trouble or teachers start getting fired, for what they say, that changes the playing field. Although, again, the state of free speech rights for K through 12 teachers, and for that matter, is actually very low. I think it's probably too easy to get fired for what you say as a K through 12 teacher under the current state of the law. When it comes to students, their rights are not nearly as strong as they were post-Tinker. In the 80s, a lot of student rights got eroded due to a couple of decisions. But we're going to see in the Mahanoy case that's coming up, I think that's going to be a real watershed. This is a SCOTUS case. Is this a family show? Can I swear in this?
You may, yes.
Okay, so this is a case involving a girl. She's a teenager, and she had posted on Snapchat, "Fuck cheerleading." Right. After I think she didn't qualify for something. Now, Snapchat is something where it's supposed to disappear, but someone took a screenshot of it and told on her, which I would like to know the backstory there, because it's just mean. So she was trying to make this not a public statement. And the question is whether or not that's protected, or she could be punished for that or not. And it's interesting because it really presents a little bit of, like, do kids have a private life that's distinguishable from the rest of their lives? And this is coming up increasingly. We have another case involving a pharmacy student in higher ed. She was a pharmacy student, but she, on Twitter and on Instagram, she cracked some pretty racy jokes. And they were saying that's inappropriate and you can't do that. So we're reaching a point where the question is there a realm of private life for K through 12, and for that matter, is there a realm of private life for even college students? So Mahanoy is going to decide a lot of the constitutionality of what's coming out of a lot of these state legislatures.
Is that the young lady that I guess applied to University of Tennessee, or is that a different? Because that was she made a racist comment that she was told on. Wasn't I thought it used the N-word or something, or just mistaken on that?
It's Kimberly Day. She's an African-American woman. I don't think she ever used the N-word. I think you might be thinking of a different case. Now, to be clear, which is understandable. We've had, I think she was University of Tennessee, but not that case. She was getting more in trouble for Cardi B, for example,
Right. Well, the case I'm thinking of, and again, I'm speaking just on a cursory knowledge. If I'm remembering, there was like a young lady that had posted some sort of social media, something, or a video, and used the N word, and of course there's debate whether she used the hard R or not, and all of that. And somebody had kept the video evidence of it or whatever, and then presented it to her, shared it out, and then her offer, I think it was the University of Tennessee, her acceptance offer was revoked. And
yeah,
I mean, it's very strange.
And that scenario, over the summer, we saw dozens of them, where someone had kept something that someone had said, sometimes, quoting rap lyrics, and this got their invitation to schools and withdrawn. And there's this kind of like nasty politicking, about sort of, I think it's called offense archaeology is the term that'll. But since we don't have too much time, do you want to actually, because I really am, the reason why it's called a beta version is because I want feedback from parents and educators, like I said, primarily parents, about what the principles actually are. Yeah.
So the principle 1, no compelled speech, thought, or belief, and there's a big difference between saying what you can't say, but then saying what you what you must say. And I guess maybe unpack that a little bit, because there's some court cases that you've listed and some thinking behind that.
Your listeners, whether you're lawyers or not, you should read the 1943 opinion of Barnett versus West Virginia Board of Education. It's a case about whether or not you can make students salute the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And it came out in the middle of World War II. And the court, to its everlasting credit, wrote a gorgeous opinion talking about the right of conscience. And of course, the most famous quote from it is, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official high or petty can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by their word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us." This is Justice Robert Jackson. He's such an historical badass. He actually left the court to prosecute at Nuremberg and then came back to the court. It's amazing, but it is this extremely inspiring vision of an independent America that actually does have a profound sense of the right to private conscience and areas where you're not supposed to intrude upon, and particularly when it comes to making you say things, compelled thought or belief, that's considered to be entirely off the table from a First Amendment standpoint.
Yeah, it strikes me is because you note and that case was more about patriotism, but then of course there's this sort of flip side in some ways in the culture war sense of like diversity and equity kind of language being compelled or thoughts being sort of chilled because of that. So I think that is probably more of an issue as we get into high school than it would be in middle and hopefully not at kindergarten. But then again, I think we are seeing some evidence of that. I do wonder how widespread it is and how big of an issue it is.
Yeah, we're trying to expand, as I said, our K-12 reach. We currently my top person at F.I.R.E for K-12 is named Bonnie Snyder, and she's coming out with a book called Indoctrinate, which I got to read, of course, and it has some really horrifying cases of, for example, mixed race students being, being insulted, about how their mother is an oppressor, and like all of this kind of like really nasty kind of overgeneralization stuff that used to be pretty taboo is treated as not so taboo if you're doing for a quote unquote good reason. And so after and that book comes out in September, and and again, do I know how widespread it is? No. Are there currently school districts getting sued over it? Yes. So there's enough that there are lawsuits, there are enough that there are parents organizations and new nonprofits being formed around it.
How much of this, especially with Principle 1, do you think is, I mean, obviously there's the dynamic of teacher to student, but also student to student, and I can imagine then coming back to the teacher of, I'm allowing that student to say this, or I'm saying that student can't say this to that other student, and, so the responsibility of the teachers to, I guess, monitor or hold students accountable for their interactions between one another?
Yeah, and one of the things I'm trying to say with the principals is that you have to try to re-inject the idea that always intervening in interpersonal conflicts among students.
Right.
I think that we intervene probably too little. Well, when I was a kid, certainly when it came to bullying and that kind of stuff. But I also think that we may have gone too far in the other direction, where where in some cases almost all conflicts where you're told like bring it to a quote unquote adult. And one of my points in it is that's not really training people for living in a free society. And I think we do way too much also in college, also in corporations now, of don't handle things with individuals individually, go to someone in charge. And that's I think to younger people, that's going to sound exactly right. That's what they've been doing their whole lives. But that's training people for a situation in which authority is really in charge of you.
Yeah, that's, I suppose, Principle 5, foster independence, not moral dependency. And yeah, I mean, it kind of goes along with the sort of free range kids let grow kind of thing of, giving kids opportunities to navigate those disagreements and do that and figure out those pieces. In a classroom setting and as a teacher, I wonder about the sort of roles of, and curious your thoughts of like dialogue, dialectic, and debate in in navigating those kinds of things.
In navigating
those disagreements or differing opinions or viewpoint diversity, that kind of piece.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy, and I'm not saying that I think teachers are in a good position, but I do think we've gone too far in the direction of intervening. And also, of course, students are smart. And to be clear, if a lot of this I'm talking about, high school students, or for that matter, junior high school, that some of the systems we've put in place, for example, for anti-bullying, while very well intentioned, when I talk to students, they're like, "Oh, you can figure out how to game that. Like, if you want to get someone in trouble, accuse them of being a bully rather than actually bully them."
Yeah, so the principle 2, respect for individuality, dissent, and the sanctity of conscience. And so I think that then dovetails pretty well into the principle 3, which is teachers and administrators must demonstrate, in italics, epistemic humility. And so, sort of the moral high ground kind of thing. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, that's a general kind of philosophical idea. Don't pretend that we know more as a civilization than we actually do, and particularly when it comes to, moral, philosophical, sociological issues. Being humble in the fact that I don't know everything about the world. Nobody really does. And teaching that kind of that epistemic humility just means being humble about how much not only you know, but how much can be known. And I think that if we promote too much of a finished sort of clear view of what the world actually looks like in K-12, we're not really preparing them for a world in which the process of understanding what everyday life even looks like to a degree can actually be an arduous process. This is a little bit of a confusing, counterintuitive idea, but my friend Jonathan Rausch is writing a book called Constitution of Knowledge, which talks about how, the same one who wrote Kindly Inquisitors, and it talks about, how this process of knowing the world how it is much more challenging than we think, and we rely on institutions, like both journalism and higher education and experts to know what it is. And I think that a lot of times students come to college and there's partially like some things related to age and attitude, but I think also educators to a degree, fill them with greater confidence in their beliefs than is probably warranted by the state of human knowledge. Yeah. Well, I wonder too, I don't know if you've considered this or thought or had any feedback on this. I've wondered this aloud on the podcast several times that, perhaps with beginning a Nation at Risk, I don't know if you're familiar with that, I think it was the 80s, which essentially really started, in my opinion, our schools on the road towards more high stakes accountability. And the incentive structure that I think has been provided, or at least I wonder about, has been provided
as teachers in schools are really trying to get test scores as a measure of quality, that it maybe has shifted our teaching and learning more towards an answer culture versus being able to have some more open-ended discussions and some of those civics pieces and some of that epistemic humility, right? So that everything is about, can you get these kids to get the right answers on tests? Yeah. So if anybody has anybody raised that as a piece, or does that make any sense to you?
Oh no, it makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, I have a 3 and a 5-year-old myself, and my 5-year-old is just in love with the wonder and strangeness of the world,
right.
And I'm really afraid that given that sort of high stakes testing kind of atmosphere, you can kind of kill people's interest in it can do great damage to people's curiosity. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think a lot about how we've and I get the idea that you need to do testing and you need to have some way to evaluate what results you're actually getting, but it does sound like, particularly in public schools, we've taken that too far. Now, of course, the backlash, one of the things I'm hearing from a lot of these, schools in New York City, for example, is now there's, a movement that to make it taboo to take the test in the first place, which it's just all seems like a mess. And like I said, trying to inject a little bit of small liberalism into the system is my primary goal here.
Right. Well, so leaning into that liberalism and that sort of small L, which is not to be confused with liberal versus conservative and right and left and political, ideologies, those ways. But, one of the things that strikes me, or I wonder about, especially even reading Kindly Inquisitors, and I haven't finished it, maybe he deals with this, perhaps he does, is sort of the assertion, and I can imagine, playing devil's advocate, that some people say, like I'm looking at the your piece and the quote or the piece, any ideology that cannot be questioned is indistinguishable from fundamentalist religion. And there seems to be almost like a pushback against liberal science or a rejection of it. And I wonder if there aren't people who are saying liberal science is basically being taught in our schools, or has been taught, or by folks like you and I, as that is the best and only way. Now, of course, part of that is questioning and constant criticism, but it's almost like I can imagine that the argument against that kind of approach is that it's an ideology that is indistinguishable from fundamentalist religion.
Yeah. No, I've heard this argument before, and I've never found it persuasive, because it's not about deciding ultimately what your conclusions must be. It's about a process for figuring out what the world looks like on your own and without having to simply being indoctrinated into it. It's kind of like when people talk about scientific method as being an ideology, and it's like, no, that's ridiculous. Scientific method is something that breaks ideology, because you actually have to test your assumptions, and you'll find over and over again that your ideology is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea of falsifiability, right? And
Karl Popper, yeah.
Yeah. And I've even seen some pushback on that, saying that not everything has to be falsifiable to be, worth considering or something like that, which I suppose is true, but...
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because there's, I've seen this on campus as well. There's like a pushback to scientific method and liberal science and Popperian ideas of the philosophy of science, as if it itself is sort of just some kind of imperialistic ideology. And then in almost the same breath, and talk about like this stuff is not knowable, and so I'm just going to say my own ideology here. Like it's as if this can be replaced with any other set of ideas that are written in stone, which is, of course, that's most of human history. People have to be reminded of it is that most of human history was this not having cultural norms, having strong religious and superstitious ideas. The way to break that is actually to try to commit to ambiguity, to commit to the idea that the world is harder to understand than we think. So I think that the current, idea of having a more thorough kind of morality, a more thorough idea of what our moral philosophy is. It's old fashioned. It's not new. It's just what the norms are. has changed.
Right. So the principle 4, foster the broadest possible curiosity, critical thinking skills, and discomfort with certainty, which is kind of we just touched on there. But I also think the critical thinking skills is an important piece here. There's actually some debate and probably more pushback from more small c conservative kind of leaning teachers that the idea that critical thinking is not something that we can teach, and that in a sense it's nonsense. And I would certainly say we can teach critical thinking. We practice it, and those are skills that we develop, and inquiry being maybe the root of that. How do you think about critical thinking and even the teaching of it?
I think that critical thinking, I think it absolutely can be taught. I think that two of the best authors out there for it right now, for example, and I do book recommendations, are Julia Galef, who wrote a book called Scout Mindset, which is doing quite well at the moment, and also the work of Annie Duke, who writes about decision hygiene, as it's called, which is, you can demonstrate this stuff's usefulness in your everyday lives. And I think that her first book, Thinking in Bets, is something that every high schooler should read, because it's just a different way of looking at the world that is more challenging. It's more ambiguous, but it's also closer to the truth.
Mm-hmm. So principle 5, we've touched on a little bit: foster independence, not moral dependency. Some of the things you note there, bias response teams, and we've talked about that, sort of giving students and kids the opportunity to navigate some of those pieces, and there's certainly a balance there. Now, 6, you start to get into some of the mental health kinds of pieces and leaning back maybe a bit more into the coddling, but do not teach children to think in cognitive distortions. And I'm a giant fan of this. I taught psychology. My dad was a psychologist. My mom's a teacher principal. So it's like, this is me in a nutshell, right? And thinking about this, but is it it's a pretty high ask or heavy ask for teachers to, first of all, understand this, I think, given the current state of their understanding of psychology, and then to then teach it? Or I'm just wondering about teachers doing this and with their understanding of psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive distortions in general.
Yeah, I want people to be familiar with what cognitive distortions are, and I think that they're more intuitive than people expect, because a lot of them are the same things as just good rules for debate. A lot of them refer to what are another other situations called logical fallacies, and I do think that I remember in K12, but certainly in my own house, my mom's British, there was definitely, just because you feel something doesn't mean it's true, that you shouldn't catastrophize things, that overgeneralizing. The overgeneralizing cognitive distortion is one that I think we do way too much of. As kids, we were taught, do not overgeneralize. Do not overgeneralize about people. Do not overgeneralize about groups. Like, that's offensive. And now in higher education, they seem to have moved, and in a lot of education schools, overgeneralize, but do it in a very specific way that actually we think is nicer or better. And I'm like, that's not going to work. People either overgeneralize or they don't.
Right. Yeah, it's a processing error.
I do think, and I do think that a lot of this is more intuitive. I think it's more folksy than it sounds, because a lot of these are norms that fit very well with older norms. But I think that teachers being familiar with it, I think that young people having some idea that there are sort of dysfunctional self-talk that also applies to the way we talk with each other. It is a somewhat sophisticated idea, but I think it has been conveyed culturally for centuries.
Yeah, and you mentioned, and I tweeted about this earlier, that learning to avoid cognitive distortions is also a good way to learn critical thinking. And I think about it as a teacher, how would I teach that? And working with teachers as well, thinking about how do we engage teachers and students in critical thinking exercises that allow them to allow us as a group to notice and point out and say, all right, are we overgeneralizing? Are we labeling? Are we discounting positives? Those are great ways to engage in the critical thinking. There's no, I mean, it just seems just sort of obvious to me, but maybe that's...
Yeah. Well, I sometimes joke that that's my way of sneaking in some critical thinking back, but it's not. It's more than that, though. I mean, like I'm also someone who's really greatly benefited from CBT, but I think that the profound thing there is that philosophers have been saying for millennia that reason can make you happy and set you free, and on its own it can't. But in CBT, when you learn kind of the habits of sort of methodically doing some of this stuff, you can talk yourself down off of that metaphorical ledge, or a literal ledge in my case, with not the power of positive thinking, which was very popular when I was a kid, which is nonsense, but with just rationality, with saying like, is this really like, did that date or job interview or that other setback that I experienced, is my life over after that? To look at it rationally, of course it's not. And I think that more of this this kind of thinking could be helpful both for smaller liberal society, but also for mental health.
Yeah, no doubt. So Principle 7, do not teach the 3 great untruths, and these are highlighted in Coddling in the American Mind. So the untruth of fragility, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The untruth of emotional reasoning, always trust your feelings. And then the untruth of us versus them, life is a battle between good and evil people, which is seemingly what we are doing in every day, all like cable news. I mean, everything is us versus them, and
100%.
it's such a, I mean, talk about cognitive distortions, right? I mean, it's impossible to, when you get into that mindset, to view anybody with a differing opinion as anything other than an enemy, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The untruths were a way to sort of refocus the whole book on what our deeper message was. And in my own family, we tend to give negative advice, which I mean is like, I can't tell you what to do, but I can give you some ideas of what not to do. And honestly, when you think about life, in a lot of cases, not making the worst mistakes counts for a lot.
Yeah.
And so we coined these 3 great untruths. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings, which is very much emotional reasoning from CBT. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker doesn't mean that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is always true. But it's bad to believe that anything that you can be permanently harmed from any little thing is a very disempowering point of view. But the final one, which is the social one, is life is a battle between good people and evil people, was something that I felt like I didn't even really need to say when I was younger. There was a sense that, we're all just people, and that even terrible people, sometimes are capable of good things, and that all of us have some nasty impulses and cruelty in ourselves. And I do think that, amazingly, despite having some of the most wonderfully morally ambiguous characters in the history of media, look at Don Draper. What show is that?
Mad Men.
Look at Mad Men or Breaking Bad or or The Wire or The Sopranos. So much wonderful stuff came out of that moral ambiguity. So I feel like the art really embraced some of this, in the previous decade. But now, I look at arguments that just they seem to want to be sophisticated, but they're more or less kind of like there are good people and there are evil people, which is just, it's old-fashioned, it's old-timey, but I think it's dysfunctional.
Yeah, and I guess, can you unpack a little bit, again, the fragility and especially anti-fragile, what that really means? Because I think that's a really important, not just for parents, but for teachers and educators just in general.
So fragility versus anti-fragility. So fragility, my concern there is not that students can withstand any trauma or anything ridiculous like that without some amount of harm. What I'm saying is that telling them that they are more fragile than they are is a dangerous self-fulfilling prophecy, which can actually be very harmful. That if you prepare somebody for being able to get over something, in many cases that they can, but if you tell them something more like, this terrible thing that happened to you is central to your identity, that's going to harm them for the rest of their lives. And that's principle 8. When we talk about takes student health mental health more seriously, we want to be really clear here. Like sometimes people, when they hear the name, the coddling the American mind, it's like, oh, we're therapizing everything. We're making everything into, we're medicalizing all of the stuff, and we shouldn't be doing that. And one of the things we're saying is, no, actually, in some cases, take this much more seriously. And I go into the example of trigger warnings. If you're talking about someone who is suffering so badly from PTSD that you believe that anything said in a class could actually lead to some kind of break or event, you're not taking it seriously enough. Like that person actually needs serious psychiatric or mental health. The Band-Aid of a trigger warning isn't going to do it. But I also think that they should take mental health more seriously in the sense of undermining people's mental health by telling them they're more fragile, by telling them that they'll be permanently harmed by words, without telling them about the fact that there is, the existence of concepts like post-traumatic growth, the fact that when you look at the research in terms of like who actually is permanently traumatized by particular events, it's not, it's surprising how many people, recover and go about their lives. And that's stuff that is not sufficiently taught. And if you set somebody up for thinking that they're less capable than they are, they might, live out that prediction.
Yeah, well, it gets to, I've had a couple podcasts or done a couple podcasts on social emotional learning, which I think is important, but there's also a fine balance of that concept creep of what is traumatic and what really is, something that would be legitimately worth crying over spilled milk kind of thing. And so really thinking about that, I love in coddling the sort of imagery that was presented of the, like if you have a lighter and you have the lighter on the flame there and you blow it out, or you blow on it, right, it blows out. That's fragile. But the anti-fragile version of that is some sort of like almost like a bonfire, and the stronger the wind, the stronger the more intense and fierce that fire becomes. And that's what we want to build in our students and our kids that become adults, is that anti-fragility, but also recognizing that there are things that we need to think about as from a mental health perspective, which is principle 8, take student mental health more seriously. And so that is a really, really delicate balance there. So principle 9, resist the temptation to reduce complex students to limiting labels. Any more you want to say on that? We've touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, that's the thicker identity idea. I do think that some of the stuff we're doing to address, for example, racial inequity leads to a situation where we're grouping those students from a pretty early age in separate groups, which or at least can interfere in some cases with the possibility or the likelihood, at least, of them making friends across lines of difference, which I think is one of the great potential cures to a lot of these divides. And the more, so I look at colleges, for example, and you have, separate orientations, you have separate dorm rooms, for goodness sakes, you have separate graduations, and like I said, I think this prevents this labeling, this grouping, prevents people from becoming friends with each other, which I do think it is one of the most important, kind of the backbone of having a genuinely diverse society, is having systems that allow for people to, have friendships across lines of difference.
Right. And I suppose there's a balance there too about sort of mandating those and making them, optional, giving the option for folks to affinity groups and people who they want to be with, certainly. Principle 10, if it's broke, fix it. Be willing to form new institutions that empower students and educate them with principles of free, diverse, and pluralistic society. So unpack that in your elevator.
This is the most controversial one because, for my early criticism of it, somebody wrote in, I love all of this, but Principle 10, but I hate Principle 10,
Really?
Because they think that all I'm saying here is charter schools. And I'm like, I don't have a...
Interesting. I didn't get that.
I don't know. I didn't either. I don't oppose charter schools. But at the same time, like this is set up as a statement like, if this doesn't work, then do this.
Right.
And what I want to do, of course, is engage with K through 12. And to a degree, like I said, make it to give people to a degree permission to believe in sort of old-fashioned liberal ideas to a degree. But at the same time, since I'm hearing this so much from parents at a lot of these sort of like elite schools, particularly in New York City, but also on the West Coast. One of my points here is like, listen, if you really think this is dysfunctional, start some new institutions. I'm a big believer that we need some new institutions. We need refreshed institutions to a degree, because there's very low trust currently in society. There's very low faith in institutions, and I think that in some cases you simply need new ones that have a chance of establishing trust. So I think right now, if someone were to start up an independent private school that was more in the sort of liberal education tradition in Manhattan, it have lines outside the door.
Well, I know we're running up against your hard stop time. The one thing that I thought was maybe most controversial was your idea or thought that maybe teachers not necessarily have education degrees, and I'm guessing you're getting some pushback on that one.
So far, I haven't.
Really?
but that might mean I'm in the wrong. I'm talking to the wrong audience. But we'll see about that one.
Right.
It's partially just because I think that there's real value in having, teachers who have had careers in advance and that haven't gone through the sort of homogenizing process of education schools. It also, frankly, comes from just a lot of skepticism in education schools. For those of us who do, free speech and academic freedom work, I've had lots of cases over the years of both education students being drummed out for being, in some cases, mildly dissenting, and also for bad programs like the University of Delaware program, which I talk about, which was at a really aggressive, very particular kind of thought reform program of you should believe these things by the time you leave this program. A lot of these programs have come out of education schools. So at the moment, am I an education school skeptic from what I'm hearing? Frankly, I am.
Well, the great irony of many education schools is that they are sorely lacking in good education and pedagogy, unfortunately, and at least that was, years ago when I went through the education programs. But, Greg, I know you've got to go. The website is thefire.org, and we'll link to this in particular. But if folks want to give you feedback, because you're looking for feedback, what's the best way that they can reach you, and any other places that they should find you or resources you want to mention?
I put a link right in the article. We're actually having that go through the Coddling website, and I don't know the address off the top of my head, but that's the way I'm receiving feedback for it. I'm on Twitter at G Lukianoff. It is my Twitter handle. My blog is called The Eternally Radical Idea. It's part of which refers to free speech. It's part of the F.I.R.E website. Those are the main ways to reach me. Okay,
and the email address to give you feedback is contact@thecoddling.com, and we'll put that in the show notes and links and that kind of thing. So,
great,
Greg, a real pleasure to talk with you. Certainly an important piece of work that you are embarking on, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.